Here we are at one of the centers where the Trail of Tears took place in Georgia. The Trail of Tears was the forced removal of Native Americans following the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Today we're talking about forced versus voluntary migrations. I'm Mr. Coulter, and this is Human Geography. Today we're going to focus on forced involuntary migration, which is topic 211 in AP Human Geography. So most people in the world choose to move. So they choose to migrate to a new place. But sadly, many are still forced to migrate to new locations. So we'll start with forced migration. So when a migration is involuntary, that means that the mover has no role in the decision-making process. That is called forced migration. So forced migration is when the mover has no decision-making. They have to leave. That includes refugees, slavery, military conscription, and any other type of involuntary movement. So we see here on this boat, refugees escaping their homeland, which in this case was Syria, escaping to find a new location. Slavery is an example of a forced migration. The transatlantic slave trade was a time period when about 11 million African slaves were brought to the Americas. This took place between 1519 and 1867. This is sadly the biggest forced migration in human history. And we see that in the 1860s, there were close to 4 million slaves in the United States alone. So the transatlantic slave trade, which brought 11 million people, is the biggest forced migration in human history. We can see on this flow vector map where people moved from and to. The biggest amounts went to the Caribbean and then South America, with many going to North America. Most came from the southern half of Africa. These are the slave ships that they were brought over on. You can see that people were shoulder to shoulder, bound together underneath a deck of a ship where they couldn't see light and didn't get much movement. It was deplorable conditions for human beings to be transferred over in. And this is an artist's rendering of what it would have looked like to be on one of these slave ships. One of the major issues that we face in our world today is refugees. That's a type of forced migration where you have to leave your homeland. So a refugee is a person residing outside of his or her country of nationality, and they are unable or can't return because of a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political party, or political opinion. And that was set forth by the United Nations in 1951. So that gave people who are refugees international protected legal status. And when we look at our numbers currently, in 2019, there were 26 million refugees around the world. So we had a lot of refugees in 2019. Many came from Syria, as we see this family washing up on the shore in Turkey, trying to escape the Syrian civil war. If you look at this chart, it shows us where refugees in the US come from. So pause it and take down some notes about how it's changed over time where people come from. Often, unfortunately, refugees end up in camps like this that are not well established and don't provide the services that you would get from living your normal life. So people escape and then end up in a lot of camps like this one. This is a cartogram of where refugees come from. So the top map is their country of origin, and then the destination countries below. I want you to take down some observations that you see as you look at the comparison between these two maps. We can see that often people who leave their country end up settling closer to home than you may think. Because it's in the news a lot, we think that a lot of refugees end up in Europe and the United States, but that's only because we're watching our news. The majority of refugees settle in countries next to their own. So we see that on this map of the flow of where people go. A lot leave Afghanistan and go into Iran or Turkey, and then some end up settling closer to Greece, Italy, Libya. But a lot of times we see that people leave their country and go to a neighboring country instead of a faraway trip. Here's another chart showing the flow of where refugees have gone. We see that Syria has had the most people fleeing their country, and then the majority of those go to Turkey. We also see a lot of people leaving Afghanistan, in Somalia. And then the Afghanistan refugees end up often in Pakistan or Iran. Asylum seekers are similar to refugees, except they are people who move to a new country seeking refugee status. So that means the United Nations has not declared them a refugee yet, and they are awaiting that declaration. In 2019, we saw 4.2 million people escape their country, but awaiting refugee status. So we had 4.2 million asylum seekers that year. We see that often when people go to new countries, they are seeking this sort of asylum. And Germany has had the most asylum seekers in the world. So they had almost 200,000 asylum seekers last year. Internally displaced persons are similar to refugees and asylum seekers, but they have not left their home country. So internally displaced persons are people who have had to flee their homes because of armed conflict, violations of human rights, or a natural disaster, but they haven't crossed an international boundary. So 45.7 million people were internally displaced in 2019. That number is much higher than asylum seekers and refugees. So the majority of people who are forced out of their home end up staying in their own country. Here are people who were displaced in the Darfur region of Sudan. So they were driven out of their homes because of civil war or conflict, but they are still in the country of Sudan. And this chart helps us understand the breakdown of all of those types of people. So we've got refugees, internally displaced persons, and asylum seekers. So take some time and look at some of the information shown to us on this graphic. We even see this in the United States. This is from Hurricane Katrina in 2005, when 1.5 million Americans were displaced. So in 2005, we had 1.5 million people displaced in the United States. So voluntary migration is the other type of migration. We learned that forced means that you are made to leave your home. You don't have a choice. Voluntary is when you choose to migrate. So voluntary is when the migrant makes the decision to move. Again, we said that most migration in the world is voluntary. And when people decide on that, they decide based on the push and pull factors that we learned about in the last topic. So remember, push is what drives you to leave a place. Pull is what draws you to a place. So let's look at the types of voluntary migration. So the first is transnational migration. Transnational migration is when someone moves across international borders to settle in another country. So we've got this chart that's going to show us the flow. If there's migration in the zone but to different countries, we see that as circles. And then if they're flowing to a new one, we see the arrows. So we see a lot of migration going into North America. It has the biggest difference in the world. We see a lot of internal migration in the regions of Eastern Europe, so people moving within Eastern Europe, a lot of people moving within South Asia, and a lot of people moving within Africa, but not necessarily leaving Africa. We also see a lot of movement in Western Europe too. So Western Europe has a lot of migration within the region, but also people coming into the region of Western Europe. And a lot of people are moving for work to the Arabian Peninsula that's rich with oil right now, as well as going to Australia and New Zealand. Here are a lot of famous immigrants that have come to the US. Levi Strauss, the inventor of the blue jean, and Natalie Portman, Albert Einstein, and the former governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, also the Terminator. So transhumance is another type of voluntary migration. It is the action or practice of moving livestock from one grazing ground to another in a seasonal cycle. So this comes from the Oxford Dictionary, but they talk a lot about lowlands in winter and then highlands in summer. So you move to warmer areas in winter and then cooler areas in the summer. And we see this transhumance happen often in Africa around the Sahara, as well as the Mongolian steppe that is on the border of China, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia. Internal migration is when people move within their own country. So when people choose to move within their own country. So they're moving to a different part of their country. In the US, we saw 31 million people. So almost 10% of our population did some sort of internal migration in 2019. The biggest US internal migrations that we've ever seen are the move from east to west in the 1800s. So people started to spread out further in the country. We also have seen the great migration of African Americans. So in the Jim Crow South, they wanted to get out because of the laws that violated their civil rights in the 1900s. And so we saw migrations where African Americans moved out of the South and into the North. And we've actually seen a counter migration more recently where African Americans have moved back down south. And we've also seen a lot of movement to the Sun Belt from the Great Plains and Rust Belt. We had the Dust Bowl in the Great Plains, and then the Rust Belt has seen a loss of jobs. So more people have moved to that Sun Belt that's in the southern part of the United States. The largest internal migration in human history is in China, where people have moved from rural to urban areas. And that's 300 million people who have moved from rural to urban areas in China. So this is in the US. We see that only 15% of people move to a different state, but 85% of moves take place within the same state. So this would be like if you just move houses or switch neighborhoods, that would be an example of an internal migration where you don't leave your state. This is a shifting movement of the population center of the United States. It used to, when the country was founded, all be on that East Coast in the Northeast. And we've seen over time that our population has moved further south and west. So now the center of the country has moved into like Missouri, where it used to be very close to the East Coast. So people have shifted over time. This is the great migration of African Americans around the United States. And you can see that the fleeing of the South, African Americans leaving the South in the early 1900s to try to get away from civil rights violations. This is the Sun Belt, where people have moved over time from the Great Plains and the Rust Belt. And we can see in the Sun Belt, it's all those areas that are much warmer in our country. And this comes as a result of the invention of air conditioning and better refrigeration, because that meant that when you're inside, people are less worried about the weather, but then the winters are less harsh. So a lot of people have moved to the Sun Belt in our country. And the world's largest migration happens every year at the Chinese New Year. So about 415 million people travel every year for Chinese New Year. I'm going to say it again because I think that number is staggering. About 415 million people travel every year for Chinese New Year. So we see this as one of the biggest migrations in world history. Another type is called chain migration. Chain migration is when someone is migrated to a new place and then their family or friends follow them to that new place. So one person might stake out and find a job in a new area, and if they like it, then other people come and join them. It's easier to move to a new place when you know someone there, or you have somebody who you can connect to culturally or speaks the same language, or maybe could introduce you to new job opportunities. So that's why we often see one person or a family goes ahead and then other people follow behind them. This gives migrants an easier settling into a place. So if we look at Atlanta specifically, we can see the Indian population in Atlanta. There's a lot of places where families have moved and then someone from their hometown lets them know about, and they move into that area. So we see in the Forsyth area in Gwinnett, also in North Fulton, a lot of movement of Indian families into that area. And here is an image from an Indian newspaper about job opportunities in Atlanta for Indian families. We can see on this map in Atlanta where Ethiopian and Eastern African migrants have gone to. We can see around DeKalb and Gwinnett, there are certain areas of neighborhoods where Ethiopian migrants feel welcome. And especially in DeKalb, there's an area called Clarkson where we see a lot of Eastern African immigrants. This is a Ethiopian church in Clarkson. So step migration is when people plan to move to a final destination, but they have to move to places in between and work there for periods of time before eventually settling at that destination. So this would be like if you have a plan to go and move somewhere, but you have to work your way to it. So let's say you're moving from Mexico and you go to rural Texas and then work a little bit to make money to move to Houston, Texas, before eventually making your way to Dallas and then settling in Dallas. That would be an example of step migration. We can see here on the right the step migration of one Bill Murray, very famous comedian, who started in a suburb of Chicago before moving to Chicago to work with Second City, which is a comedy group, and then eventually moving from Chicago to New York once he got enough money to, and then joined Saturday Night Live, and then eventually settled in Charleston, South Carolina. But you can see he worked his way in steps to end. When someone moves to a country to specifically work, that's known as guest workers. So guest workers are laborers who are allowed in a country for a specific job in a specific period of time. And what they do is they pay something called remittances back home in order to provide for their families. So they go to a new country, they work on a job for a certain amount of time, and then they send money back home to their families called remittances. We see this a lot right now on the Arabian Peninsula in countries like Qatar and UAE, where they have a lot of growth and they need migrant workers. We can see North America, Europe, and Asia all have many migrant workers that are guest workers in those countries. And then rural to urban migration. This is a trend we've seen in world history as industrialization has taken place. And we'll talk about it a lot more when we approach Unit 6, which is urbanization. But rural to urban migration is when people have moved from rural areas, so where they used to work in agriculture or specific jobs in those areas, and they've shifted to urban areas, so big cities, for better job opportunities. This shows the rural to urban migration all around the world. So this is the number of people who have moved from rural areas to urban areas. We still see that China and India have the biggest amount of movement, but the US and Brazil also see these massive shifts into urban areas. Jot down a couple observations that I didn't say that you see using this chart. Here is the number of people in the world based on if they live in a rural area or an urban area. So the urban population in the world in 1960 was just 1 billion, and there were about 2 billion people living in rural areas. The rural number has gone up a little bit. It's added some people, but the urban number has skyrocketed. We see these shifting trends where cities are growing much faster than rural areas. That's it for our topic of 211, which is forced and voluntary migration. Let's remember that forced migration is when the person who is moving doesn't have a choice in the matter. So they are forced out of their home. We saw the examples of slavery, refugees, which are people who are forced to leave their homeland, asylum seekers, who are people who have not been given refugee status yet, and then also people who are internally displaced, which means they're forced out of their home, but they don't leave their own country. We also learned about voluntary migration and all the different types of that. Chain migration is where people follow someone else from the home country they came from, as well as step migration, where you go in steps to your final destination. So you stop and work along the way. We talked about international or transnational migration, where people move to a new country, and internal migration, where you move within your own country. And then we talked about guest workers, who are people who work in a new country for a certain amount of time on one specific job. All of these types of migration are just one more step in our journey to better understand our world. I'm Mr. Coulter, and that was Human Geography.